There was something about that woman Tyson Rinaldi couldn't name the first time he saw her working. It was mid-October in the Bitterroot Valley, the kind of cold Montana afternoon where frost still clung to the fence posts at noon, and the sky stretched so wide it felt like the earth was curving at the edges. And she was out there alone hauling hay bales twice, her weight across a muddy feedlot like the cold didn't exist. She had her hair pulled back under a faded baseball cap, her hands moving between the wire ties and the cattle with the kind of precision that only comes when a body's repeated the same motion thousands of times over. Head up, even though the load kept growing. Didn't stop when the others stopped. Didn't ask for water when the crew took their break. It was just her and the work, like there was some old deal between the two of them that didn't need any witnesses. Tyson stepped out of the black SUV, parked on the dirt road above the east pasture, and just stood there, watching, not quite understanding what it was that made his feet stay where they were. He was the kind of man people didn't say no to. The kind whose name made grown men in 3 western states look the other way when it came up in conversation. He'd built something most people only whispered about. And he'd done it with the kind of cold precision that left no room for anything soft. He'd seen hundreds of faces come and go in his life, most of them leaving not by choice. But there was something about this woman that didn't fit into any category he'd ever known. She wasn't trying to be seen. She wasn't performing for anyone. She was just there, doing what needed doing, with a kind of quiet dignity that had nothing to do with where she came from, or whose daughter she was. And Tyson Rinaldi, who'd spent his whole life knowing exactly what everything and everyone around him was worth, stood on that frozen dirt road and realized he couldn't figure out the woman standing knee-deep in mud, talking low to a calf that wouldn't eat. If you've ever believed that even in the hardest, darkest corners of this world there's still someone who deserves to be seen for who they really are, that real strength isn't the name you carry but the life you built with your own 2 broken hands. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Now let's go back to that October afternoon in Montana, to a cattle ranch tucked in the middle of nowhere, where everything was about to change because one man stopped walking and couldn't figure out why. Briarwood Ranch lay deep in the heart of the Bitterroot Valley, stretching across nearly 2,800 acres from the foot of the Sapphire Mountains all the way down to the banks of the Bitterroot River, where in autumn the rows of golden cottonwoods drew a brilliant border between the dark green pasture land and the cold gray sky. 200 Black Angus cattle moved slowly across grazing fields, so wide it took 15 minutes of driving just to cross one side, and the main house stood on top of a gentle hill overlooking the entire valley, built of stone and ponderosa pine, the kind of house people don't build in a single lifetime but across many generations, with a broad porch running along the front and wooden columns that had turned silver under 30 years of sun and wind. Frank Rinaldi bought this ranch with clean money, or almost clean money, at a time when he needed a place where paperwork didn't ask questions and neighbors didn't look too closely at whose cars were parked in the yard. But over the years, this place became something he had never planned for it to become. It became the only place where he felt he didn't have to perform, where he could pull on an old leather jacket and walk out to the cattle barn at first light, and no one called him anything except his name. When Frank died 3 months ago, on that very porch overlooking the valley, he left behind a will that made the lawyer read it twice because he couldn't believe it the first time. The ranch had to remain operational for at least 5 years after the day he died, run for real and not just on paper. Otherwise, the entire $40 million in legal assets would go straight into a charitable foundation Tyson had no right to touch. That was how Frank Rinaldi, from beneath the ground, still found a way to tell his son that there was at least one thing in this world he wanted to survive. The man who had kept that thing alive for the past 20 years was Earl Dawson, the ranch manager, a former member of the United States Marine Corps, 63 years old, but moving like a man of 50, and speaking like a man who didn't want to waste breath on a single unnecessary word. Earl had a face like Montana granite, the kind of face weather and war had carved down until nothing superfluous remained, and he ran Briarwood with the kind of discipline the Marines had driven into his bones from the age of 18. He didn't ask what Tyson did beyond the ranch fences. Tyson didn't ask what Earl needed to keep the place running. Between the two men stood an unspoken agreement, the kind that exists only between people who have lived long enough to understand that some questions are best never asked at all. There was something about this ranch that felt heavy and beautiful at the same time, as if the stone walls remembered the things the people living inside them wanted to forget, as if the scent of pine wood and leather and dry hay held on not only to warmth, but to the lives that had passed through this place and never truly left it behind. But to understand the woman Tyson Rinaldi saw that afternoon in the Eastern cattle barn, we have to go much farther back, to a night 22 years earlier in a trailer on the outskirts of Great Falls, Montana, when a 5-year-old girl named Emery Voss woke to the sound of a trailer door failing to shut properly. She walked barefoot across the cold linoleum floor to the front door and looked outside through the dirty glass at 3 o'clock in the morning, just in time to see her mother throw a handbag into the trunk of a man's car she didn't recognize. Jolene Voss didn't turn back, didn't close the trunk any more gently than usual, didn't hesitate at the edge of the car door. She got in, the car pulled away, the red taillights grew smaller on the dark road and then disappeared completely, and the 5-year-old stood there until her feet went numb against the floor without crying, not because she was brave, but because at that age, a child's brain hasn't yet learned to understand clearly enough what it has just seen to know that it should cry. Bobby Voss, Emery's father, had once been a volunteer firefighter in Cascade County, the kind of man neighbors nodded to and the small-town post office knew by name. But after the night Jolene left, Bobby started drinking. And when Bobby Voss drank, he didn't drink like a man trying to forget. He drank like a man trying to drown something alive inside his chest that refused to die. He lost his job within 6 months, lost the house within a year. Father and daughter moved through 3 different trailers in 3 years, each one smaller than the last, until Bobby drove drunk one January night on black ice and the pickup truck rolled 3 times on Highway 93. Emery was 8. The police came to her elementary school at lunchtime to tell her, and she sat in the principal's office with an unopened carton of chocolate milk in her hand, watching 2 adults speak words she understood one by one but couldn't fit together into meaning. No family stepped forward to take her. No grandparents were still alive on either side. The only person willing to sign the papers was Wayne Holt, Jolene's maternal half-brother, who lived in Billings with his wife Patty. Wayne took Emery in not out of love, but because in America, when a child still has living relatives, the foster system will keep knocking on your door until you open it. And Wayne Holt didn't want anyone knocking on his door too many times for reasons he couldn't control. The house in Billings was a 1-story bungalow with peeling white paint, a front yard with a Chevy propped up on bricks without wheels, and a backyard with 2 mixed-breed dogs tied on short chains. Wayne worked as a seasonal plumber, drank beer from late afternoon until midnight, and when the beer turned into whiskey, his hand turned from gripping a bottle to gripping whatever was closest. The first time Wayne hit Emery, she was 9 years old, because she had forgotten a dirty plate in the sink. That time he used his bare hand. The next time he used his bare hand and apologized the following morning. The time after that he forgot to apologize at all. Patty saw everything from the corner of the kitchen, from the sofa, from the bedroom doorway. But Patty was the kind of person who had been beaten for so long that she believed silence was the only way to survive, and she applied that belief even to the niece who wasn't her own blood. At 10, Emery cooked for the whole house, because Patty had started having days when she wouldn't get out of bed. At 12, she worked at a laundromat 4 blocks from the house, paid in cash, off the books. The owner, an elderly Korean woman who knew exactly that what she was doing was illegal, but closed her eyes because she needed someone to fold clothes on weekends. And this child folded faster than any grown person she had ever hired. The money Emery earned went straight into Wayne's hand, not a cent missing, because Wayne said it was payment for the roof over her head and the food on the table. And Emery listened without arguing, because she had learned early that arguing with Wayne Holt was like arguing with a storm. It doesn't stop just because you're right. At 14, Emery stopped crying, not because it stopped hurting, but because she realized a simple, brutal, undeniable truth. Tears don't change anything. They don't change Wayne, don't change Patty, don't bring her mother back, don't make her father live again. Tears only made her face wet and her eyes swollen, and the next morning Wayne would say she looked like a demon and laugh. So she stopped, completely, and began doing the only useful thing she could do. Every week, from the wages she earned at the laundromat, she kept back a few dollars, rolled them tightly, and hid them in the hole beneath the floorboard beside her bed. Wayne didn't know. Patty didn't know. No one knew. And for the first time in her life, Emery Voss had something that belonged only to her. When Emery was 16, Wayne began mentioning Travis Ledger at the dinner table, the way people talk about merchandise that has already been agreed on and is only waiting for delivery. Travis Ledger was 34, owned an auto repair shop on the south side of Billings. The kind of shop where the smell of motor oil seeps so deeply into the brick walls that it can never be scrubbed clean. And Travis was the kind of man who carried that same sort of smell, not on his skin, but in the way he looked at everything around him, as if it were an object that already had a price. Wayne said Travis was a decent man, had a steady job, had his own house, and most importantly, was willing to take Emery without asking Wayne for anything except gratitude. Wayne used the word take, not marry, and Emery heard the difference as clearly as she heard the sound of a whiskey bottle being opened in the next room. Emery met Travis twice. The first time was at Wayne's kitchen table. Travis sat across from her, drinking coffee. And for 40 minutes, he never once looked her in the eyes, but looked at her neck, her shoulders, her hands, in the way a man looks at a horse before naming his price. The second time was at the repair shop. Travis showed her the house behind it. 2 small rooms, a concrete floor, windows set high at head level, with iron bars across them. And when Emery asked why the windows had bars, Travis laughed and said the neighborhood wasn't safe. But when he said it, his eyes didn't look out the window. His eyes were on her. Emery didn't need a third meeting to understand. She had grown up in Wayne Holt's house long enough to recognize the hand that grips too tightly, the gaze that controls, and the silence of a man measuring whether you fit inside the frame he has already built for you in his mind. Travis Ledger was Wayne Holt in a version with more money and more patience, and Emery knew that in men like that, patience isn't a virtue, it's a tactic. She refused. Not loudly, not dramatically. She simply stopped going to see him, never said yes, never signed her name to the future Wayne had already drawn for her. For a full year, Wayne kept pressing, moving from words to cold silence, from cold silence to meals with no portion for her, from meals with no portion to punches that left no marks where clothes couldn't hide them. Patty sat in the bedroom and turned the television volume up whenever the sounds in the kitchen grew louder than usual. The last night came in March, when Emery was 17. Wayne came home drunker than usual. The smell of whiskey mixed with the anger of a man who had just been asked for the 4th time by Travis Ledger. So has the girl agreed yet, and had no answer to bring back. Wayne used a belt. It wasn't the first time he had used a belt, but it was the first time he used the side with the metal buckle, and it was the first time Emery bit into a pillow until her gums bled without making a sound, not because she was enduring it, but because she knew this night would be the last. She had made the decision 6 months earlier. She had only been waiting until she had enough money. At 2 a.m, while Wayne snored on the sofa and Patty wasn't a factor, because Patty had never really been a factor, Emery took $340 from beneath the floorboard, shoved it into a backpack with 2 changes of clothes, a coat, and a small tin box she had never opened for anyone to see. She slipped out through the back door, crossed the yard, past the 2 dogs who knew her scent so well they didn't bark, stepped into the alley behind the house, and walked 3 miles through the dark to Highway 90. She didn't look back. She didn't leave a note. There was nothing to say to that house that it deserved to hear. The 10 years after that night were 10 years in which Emery Voss moved across the American West, the way water moves through cracks in stone, leaving no shape behind, never settling anywhere long enough for anyone to remember her. She waited tables at a roadside diner near Sheridan, Wyoming, until the owner began standing too close after closing time. She washed dishes in a small Italian restaurant in Boise, Idaho, for 7 months, until the restaurant shut down and she found herself on the sidewalk again with her backpack. She picked apples in Yakima, Washington, for 2 seasons, sleeping in canvas tents beside migrant workers with whom she shared no language, only the understanding that nobody here asks where you came from, because the answer is never the place you wanted. She cleaned hotel rooms in Bend, Oregon, for 5 months, until a new manager asked for a social security number, and Emery didn't have the kind of social security number she wanted anyone looking into. In every place she went, she worked harder than everyone else, spoke less than everyone else, and left before anyone had time to ask the question she didn't want to answer. It wasn't because she carried some terrible secret. It was because her story was the kind that, once told, changes the look on the listener's face, and Emery had seen that look enough times to know she couldn't bear to see it one more time. Emery Voss wasn't the daughter of anyone who mattered, so she learned how to become her own daughter. Emery arrived at Briarwood Ranch on a Sunday morning in early September, when the dawn mist still hung over the rows of cottonwoods at the entrance, and the sun wasn't yet strong enough to break through the gray cloud cover stretched across the Sapphire Range. She had seen the notice pinned to the bulletin board at the feed store in Hamilton 4 days earlier, handwritten on yellow paper, the block letters stern in the way the person who wrote them must have been. Seasonal help needed. Cattle ranch. Room and board provided. Paid weekly. See Earl Dawson at Briarwood Ranch. No phone number. No email. Only a name and an address, as if the person who wrote it believed that anyone who truly wanted the work would find their own way there. Emery did. She caught a ride with an old man hauling hay from Hamilton into the valley, got out at the mouth of the dirt road leading to the ranch, and walked the remaining 2 miles with the backpack on her shoulders, the same one she had carried for 10 years, lighter than it had been the first time she carried it out of Wayne's house, but not by much. Earl Dawson stood in front of the large barn at 7 o'clock that morning, his face unreadable, a clipboard in his hand, and lined up the 8 new seasonal workers in a short row. He said exactly what needed to be said, and not half a word more. The ranch needed help from September through the end of November to prepare for winter, bringing the cattle in from the distant range to the closer fields, repairing fences, storing hay, checking the water supply. Anyone who worked well would be paid on time and given a letter of recommendation. Anyone who caused trouble would be out the gate that same day and leave with nothing. Earl didn't ask where anyone came from, didn't ask what experience anyone had. He only looked at each person's hands one by one, and when he looked at Emery's, he paused for half a second longer than he had with the others, then gave a nod so slight it was almost invisible. On her first day, Emery learned the rhythm of Briarwood the way she had learned the rhythm of every place she had ever passed through, by watching more than asking and doing more than speaking. She learned how to inspect cedar fencing by shaking each post and listening for the ones that shifted, how to recognize which cow was beginning to fall ill by the way it stood and the way it drifted from the herd, how to spread hay evenly so no animal would be shoved aside. The work was hard and repetitive, but Emery knew hard work. Her body had long been used to the thing most people called exhaustion, and she called normal, what she wasn't used to. What made her stop in the middle of a task and stand there looking longer than necessary was the beauty of this place. The Montana autumn sky was so wide it felt as if it didn't end at all, but curved downward to cradle the earth at the farthest edge of the horizon. The smell of dry hay mixed with the evening wind off the Bitterroot River carried a scent she couldn't name, but knew for certain she hadn't breathed anywhere in the past 10 years. And there were moments between one fence line and the next, when she had just finished one stretch and hadn't yet begun another, when she stood there with a hammer in her hand and the wind against her face, and forgot where she had come from, forgot what she was carrying on her back besides the old coat. Those moments were rare and brief, but they existed. And for Emery Voss, who had spent 10 years refusing to let herself stop long enough to feel anything at all, they were the closest thing to peace she could remember. Tyson Rinaldi wasn't born to become what he became. But the Rinaldi name didn't give anyone in its bloodline the right to choose. The Rinaldi family came to America from Calabria in southern Italy 3 generations earlier, when Tyson's grandfather carried in his suitcase a few clothes, a Bible he never opened, and an understanding of the world that America didn't teach in school, but never stopped anyone from practicing either, if that person was smart enough and ruthless enough. By the time it came to Frank Rinaldi, Tyson's father, the family had become completely Americanized, no longer speaking Italian except for a few curses, no longer tied to any organization on the other side of the Atlantic, yet still holding tight to the core Tyson's grandfather had planted. Family is law, loyalty is currency, and if anyone betrays you, the price is never money but always something more expensive. Frank turned his father's small legacy into an empire, not the kind of mafia people see in films, with Italian restaurants as fronts and grand funerals. This was a modern criminal organization, clean on paper and filthy in the places no one checked, laundering money through commercial real estate in Seattle and Portland, moving contraband across the Canadian border through the forests of Montana, loan sharking to construction contractors, and then taking control of their contracts, and a network of influence running underground through 3 northwestern states that law enforcement knew existed, but never held enough evidence to do anything with except write it into a file. Frank ran it all by one rule he repeated to Tyson from the time the boy was old enough to understand. Never do with your own hands what you can pay someone else to do, and never pay any man you aren't willing to bury if necessary. But there was one part of Frank the underworld never managed to touch, and that part was named Catherine, Tyson's mother. The woman Frank married when he was 27, the daughter of a carpenter in Kalispell, tall, black-haired, with the kind of smile that belonged to someone who believed life could still be good, even though she knew exactly what her husband did to buy the house they lived in. Catherine died of pancreatic cancer when Tyson was 12. Quickly, From the moment of diagnosis to the moment she lay in a hospital bed at St. Patrick Hospital in Missoula with an IV in her arm and eyes that already knew, only 4 months passed. Tyson sat beside his mother's bed on that final afternoon, holding her hand, each finger smaller than it had been the day before, and Catherine said to her son the last words she still had the strength to say, "Don't become your father." She died the next morning. Frank didn't cry at the funeral, didn't cry at home, didn't cry anywhere Tyson could see. But from that day on, Frank closed up like an iron door, and the distance between father and son shifted from one room to a hallway, then into an abyss. Neither of them knew how to bridge, even though they both knew it was there. Tyson entered the organization at 18, not by choice but by gravity. The same kind of gravity that pulls water downhill. You don't need to want it. You only need to carry that name, and everything around you will drag you toward the place already prepared for you. He took real control at 28 when Frank began stepping back, and became the official boss 3 months before Frank died on the porch of Briarwood Ranch on a July morning, a coffee cup still in his hand, his eyes fixed on the valley, his heart stopping in the middle of a beat no one knew would be the last. At 36, Tyson Rinaldi owned property in 4 cities, accounts in 3 countries, the loyalty of more than 50 men willing to die on his command, and the fear of anyone who had ever heard his name in places where a real name is the only currency that matters. But he had no friends, only subordinates, no love, only women who came for the money or for the thrill of danger, and left when one of those things stopped being appealing. His mother was dead. His father had just died. He was the master of everything and belonged to no one. That October afternoon, when Tyson drove down the dirt road leading to Briarwood, the official reason was the will. The reason he gave Neil Carver, the second in command sitting in the passenger seat, was to inspect the current condition of the ranch. But the real reason, the reason Tyson never spoke aloud and wouldn't admit even to himself, was that this was the only place in the world where he could breathe without his chest tightening shut. When he stepped onto the porch of the main house, the smell of ponderosa, pine, and old leather came over him like a familiar hand resting against his chest. Frank's photograph hanging on the hallway wall watched him with eyes death hadn't softened in the slightest, and the wooden chair on the porch where Frank had sat every morning was still in the same place, untouched because no one dared move it, as if his shadow were still sitting there, looking out at the valley, waiting for his son to come home. What Tyson saw from the dirt road above the pasture that afternoon, what he didn't tell Neil and didn't say to Earl, was what happened after she finished spreading hay for the main herd. There was a small calf, thinner than the others, standing apart in the inner corner of the fence, with the kind of stance an animal has after being pushed away from the herd enough times to know that coming closer won't earn it a share. The larger cattle crowded one another at the feeding trough, and that calf only stood there watching, not trying to force its way in, as if it had already accepted that this was how the world worked, and it belonged on the far side of that arrangement. Emery noticed the calf. She didn't notice it with the quick glance of someone merely looking around, but with the kind of seeing that belongs to a person who has once stood in that exact place herself, in the corner of the fence, with no share, unseen by anyone. She pulled aside a separate portion of hay, not much but enough, carried it to the corner of the fence, set it down on the ground in front of the calf, then lowered herself to sit right beside it in the cold mud. She didn't remain standing. She sat, as if she wanted to tell the animal, in the only language it could understand, that she wasn't a threat, that she would stay here until it ate. The calf looked at her, looked at the hay, then began to eat. Slowly, she sat there waiting, her hands resting on her knees, her eyes turned out toward the field instead of toward the calf, giving it space, patient in the way only someone can be who has spent a lifetime waiting for many things and never receiving them. No one saw her do it. No one knew. She did it because it was the right thing, and for Emery Voss, that had always been the only reason she needed. But Tyson saw. He saw all of it from the dirt road, through the trembling cold air of that October afternoon, and something inside his chest shifted in a way he didn't allow things to shift. Earl stood beside him, silent in the way Earl was always silent until someone asked him something. Tyson asked, without taking his eyes off the pasture, "Who is she?" Earl answered briefly. "New seasonal hand. Came last week. Works like 2 men." Those last 3 words were the highest praise Earl Dawson had given anyone in 20 years of running Briarwood, and Tyson knew it. Neil Carver stood behind them, checking his phone, then looked up and asked in the even voice of a man long accustomed to waiting, "Are we moving on, boss?" Tyson didn't answer. Not because he hadn't heard, but because he was watching a woman sitting in the mud beside a thin calf, and nowhere in the ledger of the world he had built, with all its money, power, and ability to make people disappear, was there any category for a sight like that. When the convoy left the ranch 15 minutes later, rolling down the dirt road through the rows of cottonwoods toward the highway, Tyson sat in the back seat and looked into the rearview mirror once. Only once. Toward the eastern barn, where the shadow of a woman in a faded baseball cap was still sitting beside a small calf no one else had bothered to care about. Dolores Munoz, whom everyone at Briarwood called Dee, was the kind of person who could have a gun hidden in a wardrobe and would know it was there before you even had time to shut the door. She came from Chihuahua, Mexico. Crossed the border 30 years ago with one child in her womb and another in her arms. Lost her husband to a stray bullet in an incident the Mexican police never even opened a file on. Raised 3 children in Montana, with her own 2 hands and pots of black bean soup, and had cooked for Briarwood for the past 15 years, with the kind of quiet authority that made even Earl Dawson unwilling to argue when she said mealtime was over. Dee knew everything that happened within the bounds of this ranch, not because she was nosy, but because she was the kind of person life had taught that not knowing what was happening around you was the fastest way to die. So she watched the way other people breathed, naturally, constantly, without effort. That afternoon, when the line of black vehicles left the ranch, Dee was standing at the kitchen window of the main house washing vegetables for supper. She saw Tyson stop at the eastern barn longer than he ever had during any inspection she had witnessed in 15 years. She saw the boss ask Earl a question that she couldn't hear from this distance, but didn't need to hear, because the direction of Tyson's gaze when he asked it was already the answer. And she saw the black SUV, on its way out through the gate, slow for one beat exactly at the stretch of road where the eastern barn could still be seen in the rearview mirror. Dee didn't say anything to anyone, didn't say anything to Earl, didn't say anything to Emery, didn't say anything even to herself beyond a breath so soft only the stovetop could have heard it. She wiped her hands on her apron, made another pot of coffee even though no one had asked for it, poured a full cup, and set it on the railing of the main porch, exactly where Frank's wooden chair faced straight toward the eastern pasture. She didn't know whether Tyson would come back and sit there. She didn't need to know. She only knew that there are things in this world which, if spoken aloud, die before they ever have the chance to become anything at all, and Dee Munoz had lost enough in her life to know how to keep silent at the right moment. Tyson came back to Briarwood a week later, this time without warning, without Neil, driving the black SUV in alone along the dirt road near noon, when the mist had already burned off, and the weak autumn sunlight laid a thin wash of gold across the roof of the main house. He stepped onto the porch and saw it there, on the banister of the staircase leading to the second floor, placed neatly as if someone had just folded it, but didn't know where to put it away. Frank's leather jacket, dark brown faded into lighter brown at the places most worn by use, the collar soft from 30 years of sweat, the left shoulder torn in a line nearly 4 inches long along the seam, the kind of tear old things get when they have been worn too long by someone who refuses to throw them away. Tyson picked up the jacket and stood there on the staircase for a long time, longer than anyone had ever seen him stand still anywhere. The smell of unfiltered Camel cigarettes, old cowhide leather, hay worked into the lining. It wasn't the smell of a jacket. It was the smell of his father. It was the smell of mornings when Frank sat on the porch drinking coffee, wearing this jacket out to the cattle barn before dawn. The smell of Frank's hand on the steering wheel of the pickup as he drove along the fence line checking the herd. The smell of a man who had not lived gently with anyone, but kept an old, worn, torn jacket, and wouldn't replace it, because Catherine had given it to him on the last Christmas before she got sick. Tyson turned to Earl, who was standing at the foot of the stairs, and asked in a voice with no rise or fall, "Can anyone fix this?" Earl shook his head and said the nearest leather worker was in Missoula, a 3-hour drive, and even then there was no guarantee this kind of leather could still be repaired because it was too old, that sewing it back together would probably only tear the old seam more. Silence. Then from the kitchen, Dee spoke. Not loudly but clearly enough to be heard, in the voice of someone deliberately speaking softly, so the words would seem unimportant, even though she knew exactly how important they were. "The new girl, she repaired her own saddle last week with her bare hands. I saw her stitching. Her hands are different." Tyson looked at Dee. Dee looked back with a completely neutral face, then turned back toward the kitchen. Tyson handed the jacket to Earl and said, "Give it to her," saying nothing more, offering no explanation for why a jacket needed the kind of care his voice was carrying. And Earl took it without asking, because Earl never asked about things when the answer was written in the speaker's eyes more clearly than any words could say. Earl carried the jacket down to the bunkhouse where Emery was staying, set it on the small wooden table in her room, and said only one sentence. "The boss wants you to fix this." Emery looked at the jacket before she touched it. She looked at the way it had been folded, carefully, but not with the care of someone folding clothes, with the care of someone holding something too fragile to fold normally. She looked at the tear in the left shoulder, looked at the leather thinned by years, caught the smell of tobacco and old sweat buried in the grain, and understood without anyone telling her that this wasn't just a jacket. This was something sacred to someone, and someone was placing it in her hands. Emery worked for 4 hours in the small shed beneath the only yellow bulb hanging from the beam overhead. She didn't have professional tools. She never had. But she had the thing 10 years of drifting had given her. The ability to make anything from whatever happened to be in her hands. She made her own leather needle from sharpened welding wire. She twisted thread from oil-soaked cattle sinew she asked for from the slaughter shed next to the ranch, the kind of thread an old saddle maker in Wyoming had taught her how to make during winter afternoons when he sat repairing saddles and she sat watching, then imitating him until her hands followed the natural grain of leather like water running downhill. She stitched from the inside out, hiding each needle mark beneath the outer layer of leather, every stitch spaced so evenly it looked as if it had been measured with a ruler, drawing the thread just tight enough to hold and not tight enough to pucker, and when she finished, she turned the jacket back over, looked at the outside, and saw nothing. The seam had disappeared into the old leather grain as if the tear had never happened at all. That afternoon, Earl carried the jacket back up to the main house. Tyson took it, turned it over in his hands, looked for the seam on the left shoulder, couldn't find it, touched it with his hand, still couldn't. He passed it to Earl. Earl lifted the jacket close to his face, turned it beneath the porch light, folded back the outer leather, searched with the rough fingertips of a man who had spent 20 years building fence. He shook his head, couldn't find it. The two men stood on the porch of Briarwood's main house staring at an old leather jacket, as if time itself had been reversed. The left shoulder whole again, the smell the same, the shape the same, but the wound gone. Silence stretched for a long time. Then Tyson asked, his voice lower than usual, even though his voice was already low, "What's her name?" Earl looked at him for half a second, then said, Emery Voss." Tyson repeated the name, not loudly, almost as if he were saying it only for himself to hear. Emery Voss. And Earl Dawson, who had worked for the Rinaldi family for 20 years, who had seen Tyson order men killed with a calmer voice than the one he had just used to ask the name of a girl who repaired jackets, recognized that something had just changed on this porch, in a way he had no word for, and didn't need one. It was the first time Tyson Rinaldi had spoken a person's name twice in the same day, when that person wasn't someone he was about to bury. 3 days after the jacket, Earl Dawson came to find Emery at the eastern barn early in the morning while she was checking the water troughs for the calves. He stood beside the fence, both hands in the pockets of his Carhartt jacket, and said in the clipped voice of a man reading off a morning work list, "The boss wants you to stay on long term, not as a seasonal worker anymore, but as the main person in charge of livestock care. Salary paid regularly by the month, a private room in the bunkhouse behind the main house, starting when the seasonal contracts end in November." Emery stopped with her hand on the water valve and looked at Earl. Not with the look of someone delighted, not with the look of someone grateful. She looked at him the way a person does after spending 10 years on the road and learning that whenever someone offers something better than expected, the first question is never "thank you," but always, "What's the price?" She asked Earl only one word, "Why?" Earl looked back at her, and on his granite face there was a flicker of something almost like respect for a correct question. Then he said, "Because the boss said so, and he never explains his reasons to me or to anyone else." Emery didn't ask anything more, not because Earl's answer satisfied her, but because she understood that it was all the truth Earl had, and trying to force a man like Earl to say more was like trying to squeeze water out of Montana stone. She looked past him toward the valley behind his back, where the Sapphire Range had already begun to gather snow on its peaks, and the October wind carried the kind of cold that anyone who had lived in Montana long enough knew was only the opening sentence for the real cold that would arrive in a few weeks. A Montana winter isn't a joke. A Montana winter is the thing that kills homeless people every year along Highway 90. And the local paper reports it in 2 lines before turning the page. Emery knew that because she had survived 3 winters on the road, in broken-down cars, in abandoned sheds, in the cheapest motel that $30 a night could buy, and every time she had sworn to herself there wouldn't be another. She accepted, not because she trusted Tyson Rinaldi, a man she had never spoken to directly, even though she knew exactly that he was the one standing on the dirt road that afternoon watching her, not because she was moved, but because winter was coming and she had nowhere else to go, and Emery Voss had lived long enough to know that romance is a luxury for people who have a roof, while all she had were practical decisions, and the instinct to survive that 10 years on the road had sharpened more finely than any knife in Dee's kitchen. She nodded, said okay, then turned back to the water valve. Earl stood there for 2 more seconds, as if he wanted to say something else, then didn't, turned away, and walked back toward the main house with slow, heavy steps on the cold ground. At the other end of the state, in the penthouse in Seattle overlooking Puget Sound, Tyson Rinaldi sat in his study with the phone just set down after a call with Earl that had lasted exactly 45 seconds, and he didn't explain to anyone, not even to Neil sitting across from him, not even to himself, why he had just given the order to keep a seasonal ranch hand at a cattle ranch. He hadn't even been sure, 3 months earlier, that he wanted to keep it all. Ruth Kensington arrived at Briarwood on a Thursday afternoon in late October, driving a gleaming black Mercedes down the dirt road like a stray bullet into open pasture. And Dee, looking through the kitchen window, saw that car and knew at once that today wasn't going to be an ordinary day. Ruth was 62, her silver hair cut short and precise without a single strand out of place, her gray tailored suit immaculate, her flat leather shoes stepping across ranch mud without her glancing down at her feet even once, as if the mud ought to move out of her way rather than the other way around. She had been the personal attorney and legal advisor to the Rinaldi family since Frank was a young man, the keeper of every hidden account in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands, every front contract, every legal maneuver left behind by 30 years of running a criminal empire, and she regarded the Rinaldi family as the work of her lifetime, in the way an architect regards a building she designed. Every crooked brick, a personal insult. Ruth hadn't called before coming because Ruth never called before coming. She simply appeared when she decided there was a problem, and her appearance itself was the declaration that the problem was serious enough for her to leave her office in Seattle. She had heard the news. Not from Earl, not from Neil, but from her own network. The kind of network a lawyer who has spent 30 years serving a crime family builds with money, fear, and the habit of knowing everything before it becomes a problem. The news was this. Tyson Rinaldi had kept on a girl no one knew the background of at the ranch, given her a permanent position, a private room, and had done all of it without going through her. It took Ruth less than 48 hours to investigate Emery Voss, and the result lay inside the leather briefcase she set down on Frank's desk in the west room of the main house, the room where Tyson still hadn't moved his father's things, and still sat in Frank's chair whenever he came to the ranch, even though that chair was broader than his body needed. No meaningful credit history, no fixed address for 10 years, no bank account active for more than 6 months, no family in contact, no digital trace at all of the kind an ordinary person in America leaves, simply by existing. Ruth opened the briefcase, laid 3 sheets of paper on the desk, and said in the voice that 30 years of standing in courtrooms and sitting across tables from killers had tempered into steel. You know I don't come here over small matters, and you know I don't speak unless I'm certain, so listen to the end, and then, if you want to throw me out, throw me out. This girl doesn't exist on paper. No one lives in America for 10 years without leaving a trace, unless that person is hiding or being helped to hide. She could be planted by the FBI, could be DEA, could be someone Salazar sent, because Salazar is smart enough to know that the best way into a fortress is to send someone the fortress doesn't suspect. A person with no past can be anyone, and in our world, anyone means danger. Tyson sat listening from beginning to end, without interrupting, without changing his posture, without looking at the 3 sheets of paper on the desk, even though Ruth had deliberately placed them facing him. When she stopped, he remained silent for a few more seconds, the kind of silence that anyone who had ever sat across from Tyson Rinaldi in a closed room knew wasn't hesitation, but the distance between the moment he decided and the moment he let you know he had decided. Then he said, in a voice with no rise and no fall, "She makes the ranch run better than anyone Earl has hired in 20 years, and this ends here." Ruth looked at him, not angry, not surprised. She had known the answer before she asked because she had known Tyson Rinaldi since he was 12 years old, standing beside his mother's coffin without crying, and she knew that when he used that voice, there would be no discussion afterward. She rose, folded the 3 sheets of paper back into the briefcase, fastened the button of her suit jacket, and walked toward the door. But at the doorway she stopped, not turning fully around, only inclining her head just enough for her voice to reach him, and added one more sentence that she knew would strike exactly where it needed to strike. Frank once said those exact words too. This ends here. When I asked him about Catherine. And then Catherine died. And Frank Rinaldi never recovered. Never. Until the day he died on that porch just outside, still waiting for a woman who had gone before him 24 years earlier. She stepped out. The door closed softly, not slammed, because Ruth Kensington never slammed doors. She let her words do that for her. Tyson sat alone in his father's study, looking at the empty chair across from him and Frank's photograph on the wall, and said nothing. Not because Ruth was wrong, but because she was right, and he knew it as clearly as he knew the smell of tobacco on the leather jacket that now hung behind the door of this room, made whole by the hands of a woman who had no past on paper, but had hands that could turn time backward through the grain of old leather. The unusual things came one by one, slowly, like water seeping through a crack in the wall that you don't notice until the whole section is already damp. Emery noticed that the black SUV wasn't a ranch vehicle the first time she saw it parked on the dirt road, but she didn't ask, because she wasn't the kind of person who asked about things that had nothing to do with her work. Then she began seeing men in suits arriving at night, not coming through the main gate, but parking on the northern side road, entering the main house through the back door, and leaving before dawn. Once she asked Earl who those men were, and Earl looked at her with his granite eyes and said that was the boss's business, then turned away, and the way he turned away faster than usual told Emery more than any answer would have. She asked Dee once, casually, in the kitchen, what the boss did for a living, and Dee, who was slicing onions, stopped the knife for exactly half a second, then kept slicing and said he does many things, then shifted to asking Emery what she wanted for supper, and the change of subject was so smooth it was almost invisible. But Emery saw it, because Emery had lived her whole life by reading what people didn't say. She stopped asking, not because she wasn't curious anymore, but because she understood there are questions whose answers aren't hidden because they're small, but because they're too large to be spoken aloud at a kitchen table. Then came that night. It was November, winter arriving early, the first snow lying thin across the ground, and Emery went out to the eastern barn near 1 a.m. because a cow was about to calve, one she had been watching for a week. She walked past the large barn, past the row of smaller sheds, and when she turned the corner by the western outbuilding, the place Earl had made very clear from the first day that workers had no business being near, she saw Tyson Rinaldi stepping out through the steel door. He was wearing a black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and there was blood on both his hands. Not his blood. Emery knew the difference between the blood of someone who has been hurt and the blood of someone who has hurt another person, because she had grown up in Wayne Holt's house, and the difference lay in the way the one carrying the blood moved. The wounded person folds inward. The one who causes the hurt flicks his hands away as if brushing off dust. Tyson walked straight to the outdoor water spigot by the shed and washed his hands beneath the running water, calm, slow, thorough, as if he were rinsing off mud after a day's work in the fields. He didn't know she was there. She stood in the darkness less than 15 steps away from him, not breathing, not moving, and every instinct that 10 years on the road had driven into her bones screamed the same word, run, but her legs didn't run, not because she was brave, not because she was curious, but because Emery Voss had run from Wayne, run from Travis, run from every place that had ever threatened to swallow her whole, and her legs were tired now. Truly tired, the kind of tired that doesn't live in the muscles but in the soul, the tiredness of a person who has been walking for 10 years, and understands that running farther only leads to another place, just like the one she has left behind. She stepped back into the shadows, circled around to the cattle barn, helped the cow through the berth until nearly 4 a.m, then returned to her room. The next morning, she went out to work on time, in rhythm, without changing a single line in her face, without changing a single movement in her hands, without looking toward the western shed, without looking at Tyson even one fraction differently than she had the day before. And that, more than anything else, was what made Tyson realize. He knew she had been out there the night before because Earl had reported that she had helped the cow calve, and he knew the calving barn stood right beside the western shed, and when he looked at her that morning from the porch of the main house, she was working completely normally, completely, and he understood. In Tyson Rinaldi's experience, there were only two kinds of people who didn't change when they learned the truth about him. People more dangerous than he was, or people who had already seen enough darkness in life not to fear one more shadow. He didn't know which kind Emery was. And that night, for the first time in more years than he wanted to admit, Tyson Rinaldi lay in the bedroom on the second floor of Briarwood's main house, staring up at the ponderosa pine ceiling, and couldn't sleep. The storm came in from the western side of the Sapphire Range on a night in the middle of November, the kind of Montana storm that carried wind gusts and slanting rain, strong enough to bring down power lines along Highway 93, and when the lights in Briarwood's main house went out just before 9 o'clock that evening, Dee was standing in the kitchen washing the soup pot, and Emery was sitting at the corner of the kitchen table, writing down herd numbers in the notebook Earl had given her the week before. Dee lit 3 candles, the thick white kind she always kept in the third drawer to the left of the stove, because she had lived in Montana long enough to know that electricity here was a promise and not a guarantee, and the candlelight turned the stone and wood kitchen into something smaller, warmer, more private, as if the 4 walls had drawn in just enough to hold 2 women and a pot of coffee warming on the gas stove. Dee sat down across from Emery with her own cup of coffee and began to speak, not because anyone asked, but because darkness and rain and candlelight have a way of making words easier to leave the mouth. She said she came from a small town outside Chihuahua that maps didn't bother naming. Married at 19, her husband worked construction and died from a stray bullet in a shootout between 2 groups that had nothing to do with him. He had only been standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the police in Chihuahua wrote it down and closed the file the way people close a lunch tin. She was pregnant with her 3rd child when her husband died, crossed the border with 2 little ones, did everything from washing dishes to picking cherries in Oregon, then went up to Montana because someone said Montana needed workers and didn't ask many questions. And 15 years ago, Frank Rinaldi hired her to cook at Briarwood, and she stayed because it was the first place where no one sent her away when the season ended. When she finished, she took a sip of coffee, then looked at Emery through the candlelight and asked in a voice that wasn't curious, but the voice of someone opening a door and waiting to see whether the other person wanted to step through it. "What about you, girl?" Emery was silent for a long time, long enough for the candles to burn another half-inch and for the rain outside the window to change direction twice. Then she began to speak. The first time in 27 years she had told another person about the things she carried on her back, and she spoke in an even voice, not trembling, not catching, as if she were reading a grocery list, because that was the only way she knew how to speak without breaking apart. She told her about the long scar on her back, on the right side, from her shoulder blade down near her waist, where the metal buckle on Wayne's leather belt had left its mark on the final night she stayed in that house, the scar gone white but never flat, and every winter, when the weather turned cold, it ached dully, as if reminding her that her body remembered the things she had tried to forget. She told her about the nights she slept in broken-down cars by the roadside in Wyoming, when the temperature dropped below -10, and she wrapped herself in 2 layers of old coats and shook so hard her teeth hit together loudly enough for her to hear it. She told her about the night in a cheap motel outside Boise, Idaho, when a man from the next room kicked in her door at 2 in the morning, and she broke his nose with the base of the bedside lamp. 1 strike, précise, because Wayne Holt had taught her one thing he never meant to teach. When someone bigger than you comes in the dark, you don't get a second chance. So the first one has to be hard enough. And she told her about the old saddle maker in Sheridan, Wyoming, named Hank, 72 years old, living alone in a little workshop beside the railroad tracks, the only person in 10 years of wandering who looked at Emery and didn't see a young girl with no family, but saw a pair of hands that knew how to work. Hank taught her to sew leather, taught her how to choose a needle, how to braid cattle sinew thread, how to stitch from the inside out so the seam disappeared as if it had never been there, and he paid her in supper and lessons instead of cash. And that was the kind of payment Emery accepted without feeling for the first time in her life that she owed someone something. Hank died of lung cancer 2 years later. Emery heard about it from someone at a gas station. Didn't get there in time. Didn't know where he was buried. She stopped there. Didn't say anything more. Dee listened from beginning to end without interrupting once, without lifting a hand to her mouth, without shaking her head, without making any of the gestures people usually make when they hear someone else's sorrow. Because Dee knew those gestures are for the listener, not the teller. When Emery stopped, Dee stood up, went to the gas stove, took a bowl of black bean soup, still hot from the pot she always made too much of because she always made too much, set it in front of Emery with a spoon and a piece of cornbread, then said 3 sentences. Eat, sleep, tomorrow there's work. No pity, no embrace. No saying I understand or poor child. Just hot soup and tomorrow. Because D. Munoz knew that sometimes what a person needs isn't comfort, but proof that tomorrow is still coming and will still need her there. At the same time, on the main house porch, Tyson Rinaldi sat in Frank's chair in the rain. Not out in the rain, but under the porch roof, where the rain could only touch the tips of his shoes, and looked out over the black valley where nothing could be seen except rain and darkness. He didn't know about the conversation taking place in the kitchen below. He was inside a conversation of his own, with his own ghosts. The rain and the darkness and the smell of wet pine wood carried him back to St. Patrick Hospital in Missoula, 24 years earlier. The white room smelling of antiseptic, Catherine in the bed, thin enough that her collarbone pushed through the pale green hospital gown, her hand in his, light as paper, and her voice, the voice he remembered more clearly than her face because memory is cruel that way, speaking the last sentence she had strength enough to say. Don't become your father, he had promised. He didn't know whether he had promised out loud or only nodded. But he had promised. And then he broke that promise systematically, completely, year by year, until he became not only his father, but a more efficient version of his father. Colder, more disciplined, more alone. After Frank's funeral 3 months earlier, when Tyson was cleaning out the study in Briarwood's main house, he opened the bottom drawer of the oak desk and found a photograph. Catherine, taken before the illness, standing on the ranch porch, sunlight in her hair, smiling with the kind of smile that belongs to a person who believes life can still be good. On the back of the photograph, Frank's handwriting, the same handwriting Tyson recognized because it matched the signature on every order he had seen all his life. The only thing I ever did right. Tyson had kept that photograph in his wallet ever since that night, tucked behind the black credit card he never used, and he hadn't told anyone it was there. 2 people, one in the kitchen, one on the porch, separated by 1 floor and 1 closed door, sat inside their own darkness, with their own wounds, listening to Montana rain strike the roof of Briarwood's main house, without either of them knowing that the same rain was falling over them both at the same time. After that rainy night, Tyson began coming to Briarwood almost every day. No one asked why, because at Briarwood no one asked Tyson Rinaldi why about anything. And he himself offered no reason beyond his presence, quiet and steady, like the tide, and the tide doesn't need to explain to the shoreline why it comes back each day. He parked on the dirt road above the pasture, stepped out, and stood leaning against the cedar fence looking down at where Emery was working. He said nothing, didn't call her over, didn't order anyone to do anything. He only stood there, both hands resting on the top rail, watching her move among the cattle with that precise rhythm he had seen from the very first afternoon, and still hadn't stopped wanting to watch. Emery knew he was there. She always knew. 10 years on the road had taught her how to feel when someone was looking at her before her eyes could confirm it. And Tyson Rinaldi's gaze had a weight of its own, not the kind of weight that made her want to run, but the kind that made the air around where she stood feel slightly thicker. She didn't look back, didn't change the rhythm of her work. But from the second week on, every morning before going out to the barn, she poured a cup of coffee from the pot Dee always kept ready and set it on the railing of the main porch, exactly in the place beside Frank's chair where she knew Tyson would stand when he arrived. She didn't hand it to him, didn't say this is for you. She only set it there and walked away, and when she came back at noon, the cup was always empty, placed right back where it had been, washed clean. No one ever said anything about that cup of coffee. It simply existed between them like an unspoken agreement. Both of them pretended wasn't there, though neither of them forgot it for a single day. Then Tyson began repairing fences. No one asked him to. Earl didn't assign it. One afternoon, Emery went to inspect the fence line in the southern pasture and found Tyson there, sleeves rolled up, a hammer in his hand, driving back in the wooden posts that had come loose, the same ones she had marked with bright red string the day before. Those hands, the hands she had seen washing blood beneath a faucet in the dark, were now gripping a hammer and driving nails into cedar with the obvious clumsiness of a man unused to manual labor, but also with the equally obvious determination of a man who refused to give up in the face of anything, even a fence post. Emery stood there watching for 3 seconds, then kept walking without saying a word. And on her face was something that, if Dee had seen it, would have sent her back to the kitchen to make more coffee. The evenings on the main porch began after that. No one invited anyone. Tyson sat in Frank's chair after he finished checking the ranch. Emery came up to the porch after her evening work was done, and the two of them sat there looking out over the Bitterroot Valley at sunset, the distance between the two chairs growing a little shorter each week, without either of them moving a chair. It was only that their bodies kept finding their way closer, in the way bodies know things. The mind still refuses to admit. Most of the time they said nothing. The silence between them wasn't heavy like the silence of strangers, but light, easy. The kind of silence that exists only between people who have grown used to not needing to fill empty space with words, because both of them had lived alone long enough to know that silence doesn't mean emptiness. Their first real conversation came one evening at the end of November, when snow had already covered the peaks of the Sapphire Range in white, and the sunset had turned the valley amber. Emery asked, without looking at him, her eyes still on the valley. "What do you do out there?" It wasn't a question demanding a detailed answer. It was the question of someone who already knew the answer but wanted to hear him say it. Tyson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without looking at her either, "The things that make me need this place." Silence. The wind moved through the dry, leafless cottonwoods. Then Emery said softly, almost for the wind to hear, "I understand." And Tyson knew she truly did. Not the details, not the mechanics of what he ran or who worked for him or where the money moved. She understood the feeling of needing a place to breathe, needing a piece of ground untouched by blood, needing to sit still without anyone asking anything from you. She understood because she needed that exact same thing too, only she had come here from the opposite direction. They were both the kind of people who had lived their whole lives not knowing how to want anything for themselves without being afraid it would be taken away. And maybe that was why they sat here, on this porch, looking out over this valley, not daring to move their chairs any closer, even though both of them wanted to, because wanting something is the first step toward losing it, and both of them had already lost enough. Raymond Salazar was the kind of man that, if you met him in a restaurant, you'd think he was a lawyer or a doctor. 45 years old, black hair combed neatly back, dark suit, a soft, educated voice, an easy smile that belonged to someone accustomed to receiving guests, and you'd be completely wrong. Salazar controlled the main drug transport route from the Canadian border through Montana and down south, using forest roads in the Rocky Mountains that only hunters and smugglers knew, and he had run that line for the past 15 years with Frank Rinaldi's unspoken permission, under a territorial arrangement that benefited both sides. Frank kept the west. Salazar kept the border route. Neither man touched the other's share, and if there was a problem, the two old men sat down and talked like adults, and the problem disappeared before it ever had the chance to become a newspaper headline. But Frank was dead now, and in the world these two men lived in, the death of a boss wasn't an ending but an invitation for everyone waiting at the edge to step into the space the dead man had left behind. Salazar had waited 3 months, long enough to appear respectful to the dead, short enough not to lose the opportunity. Emery found them at dawn. She went out to the main gate at 5:30 to open it for the hay truck, and saw 3 black Angus cattle lying on the ground beside the gate post, arranged almost in a row, each with a single horizontal cut across the throat, clean, deep, precise, as if drawn with a ruler, the kind of cut that doesn't come from a wild animal or an accident, but from a professional blade in the hands of someone who knows how to use it. Blood had soaked into the dirt in 3 black pools under the gate light, and the nearest cow, the one Emery recognized as the cow she had helped calve that November night, still had its eyes open. Emery didn't scream, didn't run inside to call anyone. She stood there looking at the 3 carcasses in the gray light of a Montana sunrise, and understood immediately that this wasn't the work of a thief or an amateur act of vandalism. This was language, the kind of language that doesn't need translating. We can get in any time, anywhere, and next time it won't be cattle. She went to find Earl. Earl looked at the carcasses, looked at the cuts, looked at the security camera system that had been disabled from the outside without setting off the alarm, the wires professionally severed at exactly the weak point. Only someone with the system layout would know, and his granite face shifted into an expression Emery hadn't seen once in the past 2 months, the expression of a Marine recognizing he was standing in a war zone. Earl called Tyson. Tyson came in the night, not in 1 SUV but in 3, and when he stepped out of the vehicle, Emery saw for the first time the real version of Tyson Rinaldi, the version the Bitterroot Valley, and the main porch, and the morning cup of coffee had hidden for the past 2 months. His eyes were cold, not cold in the way grief is cold, but cold in the way a thermometer no longer has markings left to measure. His voice dropped another register, lower than Emery would have thought there was room to go. He stood at the main gate, looking at the dried blood on the ground, then made a phone call. And what Emery heard from where she stood were short sentences, short orders, no wasted words, no wasted emotion. The voice of a man who had given orders like this hundreds of times and would give them hundreds of times again. Neil Carver arrived 2 hours later with 4 men Emery didn't recognize, and within a single night, Briarwood Ranch had guards at every corner, new cameras, and a layer of security the ranch had never before needed. Emery stood on the porch of the bunkhouse, watching it all unfold. The unfamiliar vehicles, the men with guns beneath their coats, the sweep of headlights across the pasture in the night, and she understood that the only safe place she had ever had now stood in the middle of a war between men whose names she didn't know, for reasons she didn't fully understand. And she had 2 choices, the same 2 choices her whole life had always given her. Run, the way she had run from Wayne, from Travis, from every place that had ever threatened to swallow her whole, or stay. Emery stood there on the porch, the Montana night wind cutting across her face, looking out into the darkness where the Bitterroot Valley lay still, knowing nothing of blood and guns and unspoken agreements, and her feet held to the ground like the roots of the old cottonwoods at the ranch entrance, the kind of roots that had endured 30 winters of blizzards and never moved. She didn't run. The meeting took place 3 days later, at a second-floor restaurant in downtown Missoula, the kind of restaurant with velvet curtains and dark oak tables and waitstaff who knew how not to look customers in the eye when they brought the drinks, the kind of place where 2 men like Tyson Rinaldi and Raymond Salazar could sit across from each other, and the outside world wouldn't know that the conversation at the table by the window was deciding who lived and who died within a radius of 300 miles. Salazar arrived first, and was already seated, a glass of red wine already poured, a white napkin spread across his lap, wearing the pleasant smile of a man who understood that arriving early was a form of control because it forced the other man to step into a space that had already been arranged. Tyson arrived exactly on time, neither early nor late, with Neil Carver 3 steps behind him, and Tyson's 4 men sat at a table near the stairs, in a way that made anyone looking think they were just a group of friends having dinner. But the right hand of every one of them never once left the tabletop. The first 20 minutes were polite. There was wine. There was talk about the Montana winter weather. Salazar praised Briarwood Ranch with the sincere admiration of a man who truly knew how to evaluate real estate. And Tyson sat there listening with that expressionless face everyone in his world knew wasn't calm at all, but a lid pressed down over something underneath. Then Salazar shifted, gently, smoothly, the kind of change in topic an ordinary person wouldn't even notice. But Tyson noticed it the moment Salazar opened his mouth, because he had sat at too many tables like this with too many men like this. Salazar tilted his wineglass, watched the candlelight pass through the red, and said in a casual conversational tone, "I hear you've got a girl out at the ranch. Brown hair, works with the cattle, very hard-working, no family, right? No one close to her. The kind of person who, if she vanished one day, nobody would file a missing persons report, right? Sad, really. There are so many people like that in this world. Silence. The kind of silence that, in an ordinary restaurant, would last 2 seconds, but at this table lasted an entire lifetime." Tyson set his whiskey glass down on the table, lightly. No sound, just glass touching oak so softly it was almost impossible to hear. And that softness was the most frightening thing in the room, because Neil Carver, sitting at the table by the stairs, heard that glass being set down, and his hand moved automatically toward the inside of his suit jacket. Tyson looked straight into Salazar's eyes, and when he spoke, his voice didn't rise, didn't fall, didn't quicken, didn't slow, each word placed down the way a man loads bullets into a magazine. "If anyone touches anything on that land, anyone, including your men, including hired hands, including a dog you send, I won't call, and I won't sit down at another table with you again. I'll end this in a way people will still be telling each other about 20 years from now, just to remind themselves never to repeat that mistake." Salazar looked at Tyson, the pleasant smile still resting on his lips, but his eyes had changed. He understood now that the man sitting across from him wasn't making a threat. He was giving notice. And between those 2 things was a distance only men who lived in this world knew how to measure. The meeting ended 10 minutes later with perfect courtesy, a handshake, and 2 wineglasses left nearly full on the table. Tyson got back to Briarwood a little before 10 o'clock that night. He didn't go into the main house. He walked straight to the porch of the smaller house where the light in Emery's room was still glowing through the crack in the door, and when she opened it and saw him standing there in the dark, it was the first time Tyson Rinaldi had spoken to Emery Voss, not from the porch of the main house overlooking the valley, but face to face, directly, with only one step between them. He spoke briefly, without circling around it. "Someone may come here and cause trouble. I won't let that happen. But you need to know that it could happen." Emery stood in the doorway, her hair still damp from washing it, barefoot on the cold wooden floor, looking at him with the eyes he had seen many times from the distance of a fence but had never seen from this close enough now for him to notice the faint scar at her left temple. The one daylight had never been near enough to show him. She didn't step back. She didn't glance toward the road, looking for an escape. She didn't ask who might come, or why, or what was happening. She asked only one question, in the same ordinary tone a person might use to ask what the weather would be tomorrow. "What do I need to do?" Tyson stood still. In 36 years of living, in 18 years inside this world, everyone he had ever met who learned the truth about danger reacted somewhere along the same spectrum: fear, anger, flight, or opportunism. No one, not one person, had ever asked him, "What do I need to do?" Not, "Where do I run?" Not, "Protect me," but "What do I need to do?" As if she were part of this, as if she were standing beside him instead of behind him. And in that moment, standing at her door in the skin-cutting cold of the Montana night, Tyson Rinaldi knew he could finally name the thing he had been unable to name since that first afternoon on the dirt road looking down toward the eastern cattle barn. He knew what it was now, but he didn't dare name it, because he was Frank Rinaldi's son, and Frank had named that thing once with Catherine. And then Catherine died, and Frank never recovered, and Ruth Kensington had been right, and he knew she was right, and still he stood there, at her door, not stepping inside and not walking away, trapped between what he wanted and what he feared, and both of those things carried the same name. In the backpack Emery had carried with her for 10 years, there was a small tin box, the size of a hand, the kind of mint box you buy at a supermarket checkout for $1, and then forget in your coat pocket. But this box didn't hold mints. It held all the proof that Emery Voss had once existed, before she became a ghost drifting through the western states. Inside was a faded Polaroid with curled corners, a picture of a young, brown-haired woman standing in front of the trailer where Emery had been born. And that woman was Jolene, her mother, on a day when someone had pressed the shutter and preserved the moment Jolene was smiling, before Jolene became the one who walked away. On the back of the photo, the blue ballpoint handwriting had nearly faded into nothing, but it could still be read if you tilted it beneath the light at the right angle. "I'm sorry, baby. One day you'll understand." Emery didn't understand. 22 years later, and she still didn't understand. Still didn't know what kind of understanding could ever make it stop hurting. Beside the picture was a sheet of paper folded into quarters, the kind of thin receipt paper a bar prints on a thermal machine, and on the back of that receipt, Emery had written a letter to Jolene 4 years earlier, in a bar in Boise, Idaho, at 2 in the morning, after 3 cheap whiskeys she wasn't used to drinking. Written with a pen borrowed from the bartender, written without stopping, without crossing anything out, written with everything she had never said, because there had been no one to say it to. She never sent that letter. Not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know where to send it. Jolene could have been anywhere in this country, or nowhere in it anymore, and Emery kept the letter in the tin box beside the photograph, not because of hope, but because it was the only thing she had ever said honestly, without having to fear the change in someone's face after hearing it. Tyson had a box of his own, only his wasn't tin but leather, tucked inside his wallet, thinner but no less heavy. He had kept Catherine's photograph since the night he found it in Frank's drawer. But the thing he hadn't told anyone, not even Neil, not even Ruth, was the journal. Frank Rinaldi wasn't the kind of man who kept a journal. He wrote orders, wrote numbers, wrote the names of men on lists, and when a name was crossed out, that man no longer existed. But in that drawer, beneath Catherine's photograph, there had been a small leather notebook Frank had written in unevenly for 24 years since the day Catherine died. Most of it was made up of short entries, dates, and 1 or 2 sentences. But there was one page Tyson read, then read again, then read one more time, until the words blurred, not because the ink had faded, but because of his eyes. Catherine had refused cancer treatment because she was pregnant with a second child, Tyson's sibling. She had chosen to keep the baby, and hadn't told Frank until it was too late to change her decision, and then both of them were lost, her and the baby who had never even been given a name. And Frank wrote in the notebook that he had never forgiven Catherine for choosing death, and had never forgiven himself for not realizing sooner, and those two unforgiven things ate him from the inside until nothing remained but the shell Tyson had called father. Tyson read that page alone in Frank's office at Briarwood at 3 a.m. 3 months earlier, and he understood that all his life, the abyss between father and son he had thought, came from Frank's coldness. Had in truth come from the fact that Frank hurt too much to come near his son, because his son was living proof that Catherine had once existed, and had chosen not to stay. And he understood something else too. He had killed his first man at 19 on Frank's orders, and he remembered that man's face more clearly than he remembered his own mother's. And that truth, the truth that violence had taken the place of love inside his memory, was what made him know Catherine had been right, and that he had become his father, and even worse than his father. Then the climax came. Not slowly, but like a bullet, at 3 a.m. on a night in early December, when snow had covered the Bitterroot Valley in white, and Tyson was in Missoula for a late-night meeting with his legal team. Emery woke to the sound of dogs barking, the kind of barking that wasn't for coyotes but for people. And when she looked through the bedroom window, she saw fire, the hay barn on the west side blazing in the snowy night, orange flames reflecting off the white snow and creating a grotesque kind of light like false daylight. She knew at once. It wasn't an accident. While the workers and guards ran toward the burning barn, 4 figures moved from the opposite direction toward the main house. Fast, professional, 4 shadows dressed in black, stretched across the snow into long, distorted shapes by the fire behind them. Earl Dawson was in his room on the first floor of the main house, and Earl Dawson, even at 63, still slept with a Remington by his bed because Marines never really retire. The first gunshot was Earl's, and it dropped one of the 4 figures before they reached the front door. The second gunshot came from the other side, and it buried itself in Earl's left shoulder, driving him back into the hallway wall. The other 3 shadows made it into the house. Emery heard the gunfire from the small house, and she ran not away but into the main house through the back kitchen door, because Dee was in the kitchen. Dee slept in the little room beside it because she said she liked sleeping near the kitchen for warmth, and Emery didn't think, didn't calculate, didn't weigh anything except one simple fact. Dee was in there. She entered the kitchen, saw Dee standing in the far corner, trembling but upright, and took the carving knife from the knife block, gripped it firmly in her right hand, stood in front of the kitchen doorway facing the dark hallway, and didn't move. 20 minutes. Emery stood there with the knife in her hand, and darkness ahead of her, while somewhere in the house there were footsteps and crashes, and Earl shouting orders in the voice of a wounded man who refused to stay down. 20 minutes until Tyson arrived. Having raced down Highway 93 from Missoula at speeds the black SUV was never meant to handle, and Neil and his team handled the rest with the kind of cold efficiency Emery heard, but didn't see, because she was still standing at the kitchen doorway. When it was over, when silence returned to the main house at Briarwood heavier than any gunshot, Tyson found Emery in the kitchen. She was still standing there. The knife was still in her hand. Dee sat in the chair behind her, both hands around the cup of water Emery had poured for her at some point during those 20 minutes. Tyson looked at the knife in Emery's hand, looked at her, looked at where she was standing, between the kitchen doorway and Dee, exactly where a person stands when that person has decided that anything trying to come in will have to go through her first. He stepped forward, held out his hand, took the knife from her hand. Gently, slowly, the way you take something precious from the hands of a sleeping child. Her hand wasn't shaking. Her hand had never shaken, because Emery Voss had lived the kind of life where your hand wasn't allowed to shake if you wanted to live to see the next day. But Tyson's hand shook. When his fingers touched hers on the handle of the knife, his hand shook, and Emery saw it, and she knew that hand had killed without shaking, had signed orders of erasure without shaking, had built an empire out of blood and money without shaking. But now, taking the knife from her hand, it shook. For the first time in Tyson Rinaldi's life, his hand shook not because of fear, but because he had just lost 20 minutes, not knowing whether she was still alive, and those 20 minutes taught him a lesson no wealth, power, or cruelty had ever been able to teach him. He didn't know how to live without the thing standing in front of him, and he had almost been forced to learn. In the weeks after the attack, Tyson didn't use a gun to deal with Raymond Salazar, Because Tyson was Frank Rinaldi's son, and Frank had taught him that guns were the tools of impatient men, while strategy was the tool of the man who won in the end. The failed attack on Briarwood cost Salazar the most valuable thing in the underworld. Not money, not territory, but credibility. Because when you order an assault, and your 4 gunmen don't finish the job, and one of them is taken down by a 63-year-old man with a Remington, while the other 3 are handled by Tyson's team within 20 minutes, everyone in your network starts asking themselves whether you still have the strength to hold on to what you're holding. Tyson used that crack with exact precision. Neil Carver, through 3 weeks of silent meetings and phone calls that left no trace behind them, reached Salazar's lieutenant, a man who had followed Salazar for 12 years but had seen enough mistakes over the last 3 months to know the ship was sinking, and he didn't want to go down with it. Money changed hands. Loyalty turned in a new direction. Information from inside Salazar's organization began flowing toward Tyson, the way water finds the lowest ground, and within 6 weeks, Salazar realized he was sitting in a chair with 3 legs already sawed off, and the last one beginning to shake. The new agreement wasn't signed on paper but sealed with a nod in a dark parking lot in Great Falls. And under that agreement, Salazar kept the border route, but lost control of the southern stretch, lost 20% of the profits, and most important of all, lost the right to set foot on any land Tyson Rinaldi called his, including 2,800 acres in the Bitterroot Valley, now wrapped in a layer of security that, before this, only Tyson's house in Seattle had ever known. The problem was settled, not with blood, but with patience, with money, with the ability to read men that Frank had taught him when he was 18 years old. Earl was released from St. Patrick Hospital in Missoula after 2 weeks with his left shoulder bandaged and his arm in a sling, and on the first day he came back to Briarwood, he walked straight out to the cattle barn to inspect the calves with one hand, even while Dee chased after him all the way from the kitchen to the barn gate saying he needed to rest. And he didn't listen because Earl Dawson didn't know how to rest in the sense ordinary people use that word. The afternoon Earl came home was also the afternoon Tyson drove to Briarwood alone, without Neil, without anyone, just him and the black SUV on the dirt road he now knew by every pothole. He went up to the main porch, sat down in Frank's chair, and looked out over the valley. Emery came up to the porch 10 minutes later after finishing the afternoon work, her hair still damp with sweat beneath the faded baseball cap, her hands still smelling of hay and cowhide, and she sat in the chair beside him, the chair whose distance from Frank's chair had grown shorter than it had been the first time she sat there months ago. And neither of them moved the chair, because they had come closer the way the chairs had come closer. Not because either one had pulled, but because of gravity. Tyson didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on the valley where the Sapphire Range had gone completely white with snow, and the Bitterroot River still shimmered beneath the evening light the way it had shimmered before either of them had ever existed. He asked, his voice low, unceremonious, unprepared, the way a man asks whether it will rain tomorrow. Do you want to stay? He didn't say stay with me. He didn't say I need you. He didn't say any of the things men in films say because Tyson Rinaldi wasn't a man in films. He was a man who had built an empire on cruelty, and was now sitting on the porch of a cattle ranch, asking a woman in a faded baseball cap a question he had never asked anyone in his life. What do you want? Emery heard that question, and her whole life gathered inside that second. The 5-year-old child watching her mother get into a car and leave, the 8-year-old sitting in the principal's office with a carton of chocolate milk, the child beaten with a belt, the 17-year-old girl walking toward the highway at 2 a.m, the woman sleeping in a broken-down car, smashing a motel man's nose with a lamp base, learning leatherwork from an old man who was dying, carrying the tin box with her mother's picture, and the unsent letter for 10 years. All of that woman sitting here now on the porch with evening light on her face, and for the first time in 27 years, someone was asking her what she wanted, without first demanding that she prove anything, without first demanding payment, without first demanding that she become someone else. She said, I want to stay. She said it clearly. She said it with certainty. She said it in a voice that didn't shake because her voice had never shaken. She didn't say anything more because she didn't need to. Tyson nodded. One nod. There was no music, no kiss, no embrace, only a nod that, if you filmed it, would make you think nothing had happened. But that nod carried more weight than any speech anyone had ever given on that porch. Then they turned back toward the valley, closer than before, his shoulder nearly touching hers, the sunset falling across everything. Dee, coming back from the barn to get the coffee cup nobody had drunk from, saw the two of them sitting together on the porch like that, and she turned back toward the kitchen, left the cup where it was, and there was a smile on her face. She didn't need to hide because no one was looking. The months that followed were months of slow and honest building. The kind of building that doesn't rush because it knows it is making something meant to remain. Tyson and Emery learned each other the way real people truly do. Not in grand moments, but in the evenings on the porch after supper. In work done side by side when a fence needed mending. In quiet mornings when silence felt as comfortable as an old blanket. She learned the rhythm of the ranch, until that rhythm became her own. He learned to see the world through the eyes of someone who had spent her whole life fighting to stay alive, and understood that there were things money and power couldn't teach, that only scarred hands knew. The small town near Briarwood talked the way small towns always talk. Someone in the coffee shop whispered about the girl. No one knew the origins of living on the ranch of the man everyone knew, but no one dared say the name of out loud, and rumor spread the way rumor always spreads, wide and inaccurate. But Emery, who had spent her whole life waiting for the next rejection to arrive, slowly began to learn that there was a real difference between a place where she was accepted and a place where she belonged. And she learned it in Dee's kitchen, where Dee began teaching her how to make black bean soup from a Chihuahua recipe. In the trust Earl began placing in her when he put her in charge of the entire eastern grazing section, in the morning nods from the workers that grew a little warmer each week, in the way the ranch began to feel like part of her. Not because the law said so, but because her sweat had soaked into this ground, and her hands had repaired these fences, and her voice had called these cattle every morning until they recognized her before they saw her. They married on an October afternoon the following year at the Ravalli County Courthouse in Hamilton, Montana, in a small room with an American flag hanging on the wall and fluorescent lights overhead, and a judge neither of them had ever met before. But he smiled when he read the declaration, and that was enough. There was no church because Tyson didn't pretend he deserved to stand before an altar, and Emery had never trusted any roof she hadn't first tested for strength herself. Earl came in the crisply pressed white shirt, the flattest shirt anyone had ever seen Earl wear. So Flat D said he looked like a different man, and Earl didn't answer, because Earl didn't answer truths he didn't want to admit. Dee brought a tray of tamales wrapped in foil that she had cooked starting at 4 a.m, and her eyes were red not from onions but from something she would deny until death if anyone asked. Neil Carver stood outside the room with his hands in his vest pockets and his face entirely expressionless, and that was exactly the right expression for him, because Neil didn't know any other expression, and nobody needed him to. There weren't many people there because many people weren't something either of them wanted. When the judge declared them husband and wife and Tyson turned to look at Emery, there was something on his face she had learned to read through many months on that porch, the equivalent of everything he never put into words because he had never learned how. And Emery looked back at him with dry eyes, because she hadn't cried in front of anyone since she was 14 years old. But this time, she came close. What she felt then wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't some bright and overwhelming joy of the kind films like to sell. It was something steadier, heavier, truer. It was the feeling of solid ground beneath your feet after years of walking on something that might collapse at any moment. Many years later, when Emery's hair had begun to show strands of silver that she never tried to hide because she had never in her life learned how to pretend she was anything other than what she was, she sat on the main porch of Briarwood doing what she had always done, repairing a saddle with stitches so precise that no one on this ranch or any other ranch in the Bitterroot Valley could match them. Stitches old Hank and Sheridan had taught her in the winter afternoons, and that her hands had perfected through thousands of hours of work until they disappeared into the grain of the leather as if they had never existed at all. The valley stretched below in the golden light of an autumn afternoon, the Sapphire Range still standing exactly where it had always stood in the distance, the Bitterroot River still shimmering where it had always shimmered, and the black Angus cattle moving slowly across the eastern grazing field, the way they had moved every afternoon for so many years. Emery heard the pickup truck before she saw it, the way she always did, because 10 years on the road had taught her to hear everything before she saw it, and that habit never went away even though she didn't need it anymore. Tyson drove the old Ford pickup into the yard, not the black SUV from years ago because the SUV belonged to the part of his life he had mostly left behind, keeping the ranch, slowly withdrawing from the things beyond the Briarwood fence, keeping his promise to Frank, and now keeping a promise to himself. He came up onto the porch, sat in the chair beside her, the chair that years ago had been Frank's and now was his, in the natural way time passes. Everything from one pair of hands to another, and picked up the coffee Dee had already left on the railing, because Dee still left coffee there every afternoon, even though she had known exactly who would drink it for years, and never needed to ask. He looked out over the valley, took a sip, then said it without introduction, without a lead-in, the way he always said everything. The new seasonal workers are coming next week. Earl already arranged it. Emery said she knew. Earl had told her that morning. Silence. The kind of comfortable silence between two people who don't need to fill any empty space, because the space between them stopped being empty a long time ago. Then Tyson looked at her, and on his face there was that gratitude he still never put into words, because he had never learned how. But she had learned to read it years earlier, and every time she saw it, it was still as clear as the first time. He said that when he looked down toward the eastern barn, he still saw her arriving the first time, backpack on her shoulders, walking in from the head of the dirt road on that Sunday morning in September, not knowing she was going to stay. Emery lifted her eyes from the saddle and looked at him. She said she remembered, too, that sometimes she walked past the eastern barn in the early morning and smelled the hay mixed with cold dew, and remembered the numbness in her hands at dawn on that first day, remembered her back aching every night after hauling hay bales all day, remembered her legs muddy to the ankles when she sat beside that small, thin calf in the corner of the fence waiting for it to eat. She remembered all of it, but she remembered it without pain now. Tyson asked why. Emery looked at him, then out at the valley, then back at him, and said, "Because now it's a memory. It isn't fate anymore." Tyson looked at her for another long moment with those stone-gray eyes that the years at Briarwood had softened, not because they had changed color, but because what lived behind them had changed. Then he reached out and took her hand, the hand that still carried needle marks from all those years of leatherwork, still carried calluses from all those years of pulling wire and driving fence posts, the hand he had first touched when he took the carving knife from her in the kitchen of the main house on the night Salazar attacked, and his hand had shaken while hers had not. He held that hand slowly, steadily, the way a man holds on when he isn't in any hurry to let go because there is nowhere else he needs to be. Emery let it happen. Let it be natural. She didn't turn something simple and natural into ceremony because she had never known how to make ceremony and had never needed to. Below them, the Bitterroot Valley lay silent and immense in the falling evening light. The wind moved through the old cottonwoods at the ranch entrance, trees that had stood there through 30 winters and would stand through 30 more with roots sunk deep into Montana soil without moving an inch. Somewhere out in the grazing field, a bird sang once and then stopped. And there, on the main porch of Briarwood Ranch, 2 grown people, who had paid dearly to understand what loneliness meant, one lonely because she had nothing, and one lonely because he had everything, sat beside each other in silence, looking at the life they had built with their own hands. And that was enough. It was everything. Emery Voss grew up belonging nowhere, learning alone how to work, how to survive, how to swallow tears when there was no one there to catch them. Tyson Rinaldi grew up surrounded by everything: land, money, power, and a family name heavier than all 3 of those things put together. But he was just as lonely on the inside as she had been on the outside. 2 different kinds of loneliness that fate placed on the same cattle ranch in Montana one October afternoon without warning anyone what was coming. Sometimes the most important things in life arrive exactly that way, without fanfare, without announcement, simply because someone walks past a cattle barn and stops for 1 second longer than necessary. The thing that changes everything is often not grand at all. It's only a look, a hand held out, a decision to do the right thing when it would have been much easier not to. And maybe that is the greatest lesson this story leaves behind. You don't need to be perfect to deserve love. You don't need a spotless past or a great name to belong somewhere. You only need enough courage to stop when instinct tells you to run, and enough patience to build when the whole world tells you to tear things down. If this story touched something in your heart, please press like, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the stories still to come. We want to know how this story made you feel, whether it reminded you of someone in your real life, of a time you stopped when you could have walked away, or of a time someone stopped for you and you never forgot it. Please leave a comment and share what you felt from the deepest place in your heart, because every story you tell in the comments becomes part of the inspiration that helps us keep bringing you stories worth hearing. Thank you for being here, for listening all the way to the final line. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every single day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video, because there is always a new story waiting, and everyone deserves at least once in life to have someone stop walking and decide to stay.